I'm not alone in saying that it's exceptionally difficult, virtually inconceivable, to think of any other White House occupant, including Donald Trump, who would have been as indulgent of Israel's genocidal military campaign as was Joe Biden. What I think was even more surprising for Trump was that the Arab governments, including Washington's closest and most loyal Arab client regimes, who had made an incredible display of inertia during 15 months of Israeli genocide, all of a sudden grew a spine and publicly and categorically rejected this proposal. I should just add, Trump didn't invent the idea of the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And the Biden administration sent its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on a tour of Arab capitals to market this idea and recruit their support in its implementation. And to his surprise, he was basically told to bugger off, that they would have none of it, and they would not help him implement the forced relocation of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to tent camps in Egypt's Sinai desert. Any Arab leader who is seen to be colluding with such a scheme, whether willingly or covertly, is committing political suicide, would be signing their own death warrant.
Okay, welcome back, Mouin. Very grateful to have you here to share your expertise.
Pleasure
Uh,
to be with you again.
Excellent, excellent. There have been so many events occurring over the past couple of weeks. I thought I'd start off by asking you to sort of give our audience an update, particularly in the light of the fact that, it seems a lot of people have forgotten that Trump makes a lot of noises with his mouth that don't necessarily have any connection to reality or what's going to happen. And a
That's
lot of
right.
people are focusing on the words he's saying. The way I look at it is what he's saying is just impossible. Reality won't allow it. He's saying that he's going to force, or rather, not even force all the Palestinians out of Gaza, but they will voluntarily leave to Egypt
And
or
love
Jordan.
it. Hmm.
Right. They'll love it. Right. They'll love it so much they won't want to go back. In the
Mhm.
meantime, he's going to redevelop the whole area with money from the Gulf states and then not let them back in. And at one point, I think he even said something about U.S. boots on the ground perhaps could be used to allow this. The way I look at it, that's impossible. The Palestinians in Gaza are not going to allow that. The U.S. military soldiers, I would be very surprised if they could get a lot of soldiers to occupy Gaza. Then you have the Gulf state dictators. I don't think that they're going to see it as even possible for themselves to allow such a plan. On the other hand, it seems like the only eventuality that I don't see any major impediment to is just giving the Israeli government the green light to restart the genocide, the bombing, etc. And of course, that is just as undesirable. How do you make sense of all of these news stories, all of these statements, developments, etc.?
Well, let's backtrack a little and look at what's actually happened before discussing what's being said. What actually happened is that the Biden administration, which gave its unconditional, total, unqualified support to Israel's genocide since October of 2023, is now past tense. And I think I'm not alone in saying that it's exceptionally difficult, virtually inconceivable, to think of any other White House occupant, including Donald Trump, who would have been as indulgent of Israel's genocidal military campaign as was Joe Biden. And I think it's fair to say that it would have continued with perhaps only minor modifications under the auspices of Kamala Harris had she won the election. She lost the election. Trump won the election. And I think his initial motivation was that he didn't want a foreign policy crisis on his plate on the day of his inauguration, on the 20th of January, 2025. He had, of course, bragged about resolving the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. He took a look at it and saw it was just slightly more complicated than that. And then he saw that there was already a ceasefire, a draft ceasefire agreement on the table regarding Gaza, actually since May of last year. And the only reason that it hadn't been formally endorsed and implemented is because Israel, with the total and unconditional encouragement of the United States, refused to accept it. And Trump recognized that it would take no more than a phone call to Netanyahu saying this agreement is going to be implemented. And indeed, that's what happened. He sent his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. And bear in mind, this was all taking place before Trump even assumed office. Sent him to the Middle East. He went to Israel, met with Netanyahu, gave him his marching orders, and lo and behold, 72 hours later, if not less than that, we had a ceasefire agreement that was accepted by Israel. Um, the question then became, was Trump merely interested in a cheap diplomatic achievement in preventing a foreign policy crisis on the day of his inauguration, something that would have added symbolism because there were also American captives in the Gaza Strip, and this might bring back memories of Jimmy Carter, who had passed away just days before. Or did he want to be kind of, the Ronald Reagan presiding over these people emerging from captivity? And was that really the only thing that interested him, the optics? Or was this going to be part of a larger diplomatic initiative? The problem here is that at Israel's insistence, we were not dealing with a single comprehensive resolution. In other words, a mutual declaration of a cessation of hostilities, an exchange of captives, and so on. But rather, it was a three-stage agreement. The first stage consisted of a suspension of hostilities, a surge in humanitarian supplies to the Gaza Strip, free movement for forcibly displaced Palestinians from the who had been dislocated to the central and southern regions of the Gaza Strip, back to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, and a limited exchange of captives. The second stage would include a completion of the exchange of captives and, crucially, a durable cessation of hostilities. Now, everyone who had looked at this, including quite prominently Israeli analysts, including Israeli negotiators, were saying that for Netanyahu, a key motivation would be to prevent the ceasefire from reaching its second stage. In other words, he would implement the first stage, but when it came to actually having to implement a durable ceasefire and a more comprehensive exchange of captives, he'd do everything possible to derail the agreement for a variety of personal and political and ideological and strategic motives. Netanyahu then went to Washington, and at the same time, Trump began to make these crazy proposals about emptying the Gaza Strip of its inhabitants, rebuilding it as a Gaza Riviera, but not for its Palestinian residents, who he said would be permanently expelled to various parts of the Arab world, but for what he called world citizens. Again, as with all such imperial and colonial initiatives, it's presented as a favor to its victims. And it's quite clear, that if this were ever to come to pass, it Palestinians would be expelled from the Gaza Strip. These beautiful cities and so on that Trump was talking about would basically be tent camps in the desert, and that would be the end of it. And Israel would go in and annex the territory and build new settlements, and that would be the end of the story. Now, why was Trump doing this? You know, trying to understand Trump's political agenda is little bit like doing a strategic analysis of yogurt. It's really impossible to tell. Did he mean this seriously? Was he simply repeating what he had been told by his son-in-law, Prince Jared of Kushner? Um, Trump has a habit of having an agenda that reflects his most recent conversation. We don't really know who whispered it into his ear and told him this was. He quite clearly had been convinced that this was a practical plan, that he could bully the Arab states, particularly client regimes like Egypt and Jordan, into accepting it, and that the Palestinians would be a pushover. Well, several things happened. First of all, uh, the intended victims have a say in the matter as well. And more than 500,000, as he was speaking, were voting with their feet, not heading south to the Egyptian border in order to escape the Gaza Strip, as Trump had predicted, but going back north to their devastated communities and what was or wasn't left of their homes. What I think was even more surprising for Trump was that the Arab governments, including Washington's closest and most loyal Arab client regimes, who had made an incredible display of inertia during 15 months of Israeli genocide, all of a sudden grew a spine and publicly and categorically rejected this proposal. I should just add, Trump didn't invent the idea of the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. It has been on Israel's agenda since the early 1950s. In other words, almost 2 decades before Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip began in 1967. We can get into the reasons for that later. But it once again became, for all intents and purposes, an official Israeli policy in the aftermath of the October 7, 2023 attacks, with the difference that this time it wasn't just an Israeli policy, but was openly embraced by Israel's American patron. And the Biden administration sent its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on a tour of Arab capitals to market this idea and recruit their support in its implementation. And to his surprise, he was basically told to bugger off, that they would have none of it, and they would not help him implement the forced relocation of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to tent camps in Egypt's Sinai desert. This time, they didn't just express their rejection behind closed doors in polite terms, but did so publicly and directly and unambiguously. And the reasons for this, I think, aren't very difficult to understand. It's one thing for these Arab governments to do nothing while Israel is slaughtering Palestinians within their own homeland. It's quite another to have an American president get up and say, these governments are basically going to open their borders. We are going to empty the Gaza Strip and, by implication, the West Bank and potentially even Israel of all its Palestinians and send them to these Arab countries. And they are going to cooperate with us in doing so. In other words, this was no longer an issue of how Arab governments view Israel dealing with the Palestinians, but it would affect them directly. And there's a history here. I mean, in the 1930s and the 1940s, the Hashemite rulers of Jordan, King Abdullah's great grandfather, who was also named Abdullah, in fact, colluded with the Zionist movement to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state in 1948. He paid for it with his life. He then King Hussein was then almost overthrown in 1956 and had to be saved by the dispatch of British forces to Jordan in 1958.
Yeah,
In
if I may
1970,
If I may
Yeah,
jump in
please.
for just a short second, Moin. Actually, I just wrote an article about that. You can literally see it on the face of King Abdullah when he's sitting with Trump, because you can just see he feels like a dead man walking. If he goes too much with Trump, he's dead, and
Yeah.
if he refuses Trump too much, he is dead. So he's
Yeah.
squinting his eyes there like somebody who feels he's a dead man walking, you know?
Yes, because I mean, what happened is, there was a successful mass expulsion of Palestinians. It happened in 1948. Did that resolve the issue? No, it simply meant that Palestinians took up arms against Israel from the territories and countries to which they had been expelled. The West Bank, the Gaza Strip, which were not yet under Israeli occupation, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And in Jordan's case, that ended up meaning several years of intensive Israeli bombings and attacks on Jordanian territory, and ultimately in 1970 led to an armed conflict between rather the Jordanian leadership, Jordanian state, and the PLO, known as Black September. So there's that context. And more importantly, given the strength of Arab feeling about Palestine, and given the centrality of the Nakba to not only contemporary Palestinian identity, but to Arab perceptions of Palestine, and so on, any Arab leader who is seen to be colluding with such a scheme, whether willingly or covertly, is committing political suicide, would be signing their own death warrant. So, these very strong Arab reactions you're getting are not a sign of a sudden rediscovered Arab state solidarity with the Palestinians. It's an act of self-preservation. And therefore, I think, they gave such a strong reaction that if you remember, at some point, Trump began to backtrack, also because there was opposition from those isolationist elements of his own base. And then, as Trump does, you get all this, crazy rhetoric, his press secretary describing it as a majestic plan, saying the US will own it, and so on. Um, I would say let's focus on what he does more than we focus on what he says. I mean, just to give one other brief example, you'll remember that in after his election, he several times publicly stated that if the hostages are not released by the time I enter office, there will be hell to pay. And everyone interpreted this as a direct threat to Hamas, basically, that he was, for all, practically authorizing Israel to drop atomic weapons on the Gaza Strip. Well, what it turned out is that what he really meant is that this deal had to be concluded, and anyone who was obstructing it was going to suffer the consequences. Well, that turned out to have consequences primarily for Israel because Hamas had already accepted the agreement and Israel had not. Similarly, his latest high noon ultimatum was again seen as a threat to Hamas. Um, and if I can just briefly explain, Hamas on Monday stated that it was indefinitely suspending further exchanges of captives with Israel because of Israeli violations of the first stage of the ceasefire agreement, violations that were accurate as reported by Israeli officials quoted in the Israeli press and in the New York Times, where they freely admitted that Hamas had a convincing case that Israel was not implementing its obligations under this agreement. Trump then came out and said, high noon, and if they're not released, there will be hell to pay. Well, now all of a sudden, today, Israel is suddenly fulfilling many more of its obligations under this agreement. And it looks like the exchange of captives this weekend is back on track. So, what all of us saw as a direct threat by Trump against Hamas was, in fact, a threat that the process needs to be put back on track, irrespective of who is responsible. So, we have this kind of ingrained pro-Israeli mindset of Israel's stenographers in the Western media, who immediately assume, you know, it's always the Palestinians who are culpable, and that any dissatisfaction expressed about this process must be directed at the Palestinians. Well, that's not how it worked. That's not how it ended up.
Mm. Yeah, I just saw a story. I'm reading this in the Times of Israel, but they're citing a Axios report that officials in the Israeli government have said that as long as the originally agreed upon three captives are released on Saturday, then the ceasefire will continue according to its terms. That's something that, definitely goes against the coverage we've been seeing over the past few days. Is that? But I'm not sure if I have
No,
picked up
that's
on.
correct.
Okay, okay.
So here's what happened. If you'll remember, in the previous release of Israeli captives, the not this past weekend, but the weekend before, they appeared to be healthy and in reasonably good shape, and were released from hospital, if I'm correct, without much ado. And the doctors who treated them said they didn't appear to be suffering any serious consequences. And you began to get all these reports that, they were given some secret medication to fatten them up before they were released. Well, they were given something. It's called food and nutrition. Then you have the three who were released this past weekend who appeared much more emaciated and callow and so on. We don't exactly know why. I mean, we do know that there was a genocidal siege on the Gaza Strip, but why did these three seem to be in considerably more worse shape than the ones released a week before? Was it because they were being held in an area where it was much more difficult to obtain food and water and medicine? Were they held under more difficult circumstances because of Israeli surveillance of the area? Were they being held by a group that had much less access to food? We really don't know, or at least not yet. And then when Hamas announced its suspension, all of a sudden you had all the Israel flunkies and apologists saying, yeah, it has nothing to do with Hamas's allegations of Israeli violations. Hamas just needs more time to fatten them up to prevent another scandal when they're released. Well, Hamas, from the moment it announced the suspension Monday, said, we're making this announcement Monday because the release isn't scheduled until Saturday. And if the mediators manage to get Israel to fulfill its obligations in the intervening days, we're on again on Saturday. Well, that's exactly what happened. But just to get back to your point, Netanyahu then came out with a very bellicose statement. If they're not released, there will be hell to pay. I've mobilized the army. They're on high alert. Leaves have been canceled. Intensive overflights of the Gaza Strip resumed. And I had a sneaking suspicion at the time that what may really have been going on is that Netanyahu was getting ready to cave in, and that when the exchange does go through this weekend, he'll be able to say, it's not because Hamas forced me to fulfill my obligations. It's not because I got another phone call from Steve Witkoff saying Trump says fulfill the agreement or else. No, it's because I made these bellicose threats and I really intimidated these Palestinians, and that's why they changed their mind and are releasing them again. As to the whole story of Hamas needing to keep these captives for a few more weeks in order to fatten them up, not a word anymore about any of that.
Mm. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
I find that analysis very persuasive. I just want to ask a kind of summary question in terms of how are you viewing the next month or two in terms of what are the possible futures? What looks most likely? Because the it seems like what you're tracing out here is that the originally agreed upon deal might actually, despite all of this noise, fire, fury, etc., rhetorical fire and fury, it still might go through. What about how do you see the role of I've called them the Beverly Hillbillies of the Arabian Peninsula states, the Gulf dictatorships. Do you think that they might actually, despite all of their weaknesses and flaws as client states of the U.S., actually end up playing a constructive role simply by telling Trump, we're very happy to pour tons of money into this reconstruction, but it has to be part of a Palestinian state where the inhabitants are allowed to reside. Is that just wish casting, or do you think that there's even a possibility of that sort of eventual outcome, or do you think the most
Well,
likely outcome is just the ceasefire deal continuing?
well, you're asking me a very difficult question, but I'll try to answer it, and because it has several different dimensions. First of all, regarding the ceasefire agreement, it's quite clear now that the first stage of it is back on track, and we've heard noises from the U.S. administration that it also wants negotiations on the second stage to proceed. And if I can just backtrack very briefly and say that when Hamas announced its suspension of the next captive exchange, it of course cited the Israeli violations that are confirmed by Israeli officials cited in the Israeli and U.S. Press. But there were two other issues involved as well that I don't think Hamas pointed to. The first is Netanyahu's orders to his negotiators not to engage in discussions on the second stage of the ceasefire agreement. And this is important because although the agreement um, enumerates the objectives of the second stage, it didn't specify the mechanisms for reaching it, and those remain to be negotiated. And those negotiations were supposed to commence on the 16th day of the first stage of the agreement. And so Netanyahu, basically by saying, I'm not going to, I reject negotiations about concluding the agreement for the second stage of the agreement, and my plan is still total victory, etc., was basically saying he's going to derail the agreement. In addition to that, he then came out with a new proposal saying that if the Hamas leadership accepts to leave the Gaza Strip and dismantles all its military capabilities, and additionally renounces any role in governance and administration of the Gaza Strip, then Israel would be prepared to consider a durable ceasefire. This, of course, is an entirely different agreement, if you will, than that which had already been negotiated and concluded between Israel and Hamas. So Israel is basically trying to comprehensively rewrite an agreement that had already been reached. And then comes Trump with his harebrained scheme about Gaza Riviera, and that kind of obliterates the meaning of any element of the January agreement. So you have to see it in that broader scheme. So when you ask me about what to expect in the next few months, I think the first stage is on track. Will there be negotiations on a second stage, and will those negotiations be successful? Well, I think here we need to understand the nature of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Yes, Israel has a lot of flunkies in the U.S. Congress and in the U.S. media and so on. But ultimately, this is a typical traditional relationship between a superpower and a regional proxy. In other words, you can listen to everything Netanyahu has to say and look at everything that he does, but that is essentially irrelevant because decisions about Israeli conduct will be made in Washington and not Israel. And at the end of the day, Israel will do as it's told. If you see the agreement proceed to a second stage, that's because the U.S. has decided that it wants the agreement to proceed. If the agreement collapses, that is because Israel has been given a green light by Washington to derail the agreement. So that's first part of my response. The second regarding the Arab states, again, I would like to emphasize that what Trump is proposing directly threatens the security and stability of each and every Arab government, Arab state, Arab regime. In other words, their responses are not motivated by any solidarity or concern or fear of Israel or the Palestinians. Their response is motivated by their desire for self-preservation. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do the right thing to save themselves, but they're not going to commit political suicide in order to please Trump. And there, I think there is at least a legitimate reason for hope that they will push back strongly enough, particularly because Trump also, wants to seek to expand the normalization agreement to include Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is no longer in a position where it can accept such an agreement that only makes some cosmetic gestures towards the Palestinians. Given the strength of opinion within Saudi Arabia, indeed throughout the entire Arab world, Saudi Arabia at this stage cannot afford to go along with the Jared Kushner type agreement, as did the United Arab Emirates. There's an Arab summit coming up on the 27th of this month. That'll give clear signs.
Mm.
And what's interesting here, Karim, getting back to your point, is, King Abdullah got completely railroaded by Trump in their meeting yesterday. He's been very severely criticized throughout the Arab world because Trump was basically not only calling for the mass expulsion of Palestinians, but essentially calling Jordanian sovereignty into question. And the Jordanian monarch clearly did not want to say anything that could upset his very vain and egotistical host in front of the television cameras. But it wasn't a good look. Well, the result of this is that Washington's other very close Arab ally, General Sisi of Egypt, has indefinitely postponed his visit to Washington, which was due to take place, I believe, next week, because he doesn't want to sit in the same hot seat.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It was to be very honest, it was a pathetic look when you saw King Abdullah. It's like a how can you say that?
You're
A
in the
trained
headlights?
dog,
Oh,
a
Sorry?
trained. Oh, like a trained dog. He was sitting there, and his eye squinting was was so revealing. It's really really amazing. Um, so I have a bit of another question, and maybe a bit of an ethical, moral question. I don't know how to exactly say this, but there is this constantly this discussion in anti-imperialist online spheres where you have one side saying that putting a lot of blame on Palestinians and Arabs themselves. I'm talking about analysts like Scott Ritter and George Galloway, who's saying that the PA and all the Arab leaders put this on themselves, and but also more serious analysts like Kevork Al-Mashan, who say like we have a problem there. There's no unity in the Arab world. Um, Others, such as myself, but for example, also Michael Hudson, would say that there's also a heavy structural problem of US imperialism being just so powerful that there is unity is not really possible. Um, and I find that as Westerners saying that pointing the fingers at Arab leaders and the Arab world, I find that in a pretty distasteful because these are our democratically elected governments that are throwing the bombs. So I think the first onus is on us. My question to you is, how do you see that, Moeen? What stands most, if just very crude question, what do you see as what is standing most between the Palestinians and liberation? Do we need to put the onus on the people there, or actually do we have a much more bigger responsibility in our part of the world?
Well, responsibility, of course, lies first and foremost with those doing the actual genocide and those arming it and those giving it diplomatic and political cover. I mean, let's be unambiguously clear about that. Um, Having said that, and I've made this point elsewhere, is that I don't think, even with Biden, that this could have continued for as long as it did, in the way it did, without the total inertia of Arab governments. But regarding the criticisms you mentioned, I mean, the West imposes these regimes on us and then holds us to account that these leaders serve Western rather than Arab interests. That's a little rich, I would say. I mean, these are leaders who are sustained as part of a Western imperial project. It's not as if they were produced by popular revolutions throughout the Arab world. Quite to the contrary, in fact. Um, so that would be my 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 main response to your point, and that you know people throughout the past year have constantly brought up this incident where during the 1982 siege of Beirut, uh, President Reagan called the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, and having seen pictures of dismembered Palestinian infants from Israel's saturation bombing of the Lebanese capital, basically accused Begin of perpetrating what he called, quote unquote, a Holocaust and said it had to stop. Of course, Begin huffed and puffed, but within a day or two, the bombings came to an end. And it's presented as kind of, even Reagan was moved by images of dead and dismembered Arab children, but Biden wasn't. Well, that's not really the whole story. The story is that at the time, Reagan received a phone call from the Saudi crown prince at the time, Prince Fahd, who basically told him that Israel's rampage against Lebanon and its capital, Beirut, is causing real problems for pro-Western Arab leaders. And if this continues for much longer, it could reach a point where it begins to affect our security and stability. So please use your influence with your Israeli proxy to bring this to an end. And that's what happened. And what's really telling this time is that the Arab states have done absolutely nothing. I mean, Egypt hasn't sent a drop of water or a grain of wheat or an aspirin into the Gaza Strip unless it had Israeli permission to do so. And, it's a different Arab world than existed in 1982. But the main reason is because Western influence has become so much stronger in the region. So, you know, um, these leaders, I would say to these Western critics, they're yours, not ours. So don't try to hold us to account for them. We should hold you to account for them.
Yeah, and then one small addition to that question. So, how would you, what do you think is the reason why um, Arab leaders now seem to get away with so much more than back in the day? I think I feel that that kind of militancy that you saw back in the day in activism and also that kind of rage with regards to Palestine seems to be a bit gone. Maybe it's the neoliberalization of also the Arab world, or social media, the kind of atomization you see among people. I have no idea what it exactly is, but do you have any um, idea?
I don't have a clear and definitive answer to that, but I will say that, the formal Arab state system, which for all its faults at least existed, has been really shattered over the course of the past 2 decades, beginning with the invasion and occupation and destruction of Iraq. Secondly, you have the situation where you've had multiple conflicts in the Arab world, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in you know, in other places in the Arab world, and many Arabs have reached a stage where they need to prioritize on getting their next meal, on finding a job. And it becomes much more difficult for them under those circumstances to mobilize. But a third factor, and perhaps a more important one, is of course you had the decade of Arab upheaval. And I think the lesson that many Arab rulers and governments and security services took for that is that you can't allow any popular mobilization about anything. Because if you let people demonstrate into the streets about Gaza, then you never know where it's going to end up. If you can't give an inch because you'll end up losing a mile. And so the repression has become much more severe and much more sustained. But having said that, we have seen very, very widespread expressions of solidarity with the Palestinians, particularly in late 23 and early 24. I mean, these massive million-man marches in the streets of Yemen, which is far and away the poorest Arab country. You've seen demonstrations in areas of Syria that were completely devastated by the civil war there at the time as well. But in countries, let's say like Egypt, like Morocco, like Saudi Arabia. I think these kinds of mobilizations and expressions of solidarity have been much more policed. Another thing, of course, to remember is that many Arab governments today are not only under much greater U.S. influence than they were in decades past, but also have much closer relations with Israel than they did previously, and see Israel and cooperation with it as important to their own security and stability.
Mm. And just to add on to that, also in the 80s and before, you had the USSR as
Yeah.
an opposite pole, and that profoundly affected US domestic policy and foreign policy. But I'm wondering how you think about China in the current system, because obviously they don't present the same kind of ideological challenge. They're not, the head of an opposite pole in terms of an entirely different economic bloc, but that might yet develop. It seems like the U.S. ruling class is very much pushing China in that direction. How do you see the role of China, and do you see any sort of analogous role to the USSR, or do you see it entirely de novo in a totally different way? What are your thoughts?
Well, well, it's a very different role than that played by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I mean, during the Cold War, you had a direct geopolitical contest, rivalry between the US and the USSR for dominance over the Middle East. China is not challenging US hegemony in the same way, but China, over the course of the past 2 decades, has become the most important economic player in the region. I mean, most Middle East oil is exported not to Europe and North America, but to China. Um, China is the largest trading partner of many of these states, particularly the wealthiest ones. And the Chinese proportion of imports in the region is, if I'm not mistaken, higher than imports from any other state or market, including the European Union. I believe that's true, but I'd have to double check. What's interesting is that China has now also begun to play a political diplomatic role in the region, most prominently when it brokered the Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement. I believe that was about two years ago, which is really, I think, an unprecedented involvement of China in the politics of the region. Then last year, it hosted in Beijing a meeting of the Palestinian political movements, including Hamas and Fatah, leading to a joint communique between them. And the other interesting thing is if you go, for example, to the United Nations Security Council, as China is increasingly challenged and threatened by the West, and particularly by the United States, it has become more and more vocal on the issue of Palestine, pointing out quite clearly the extraordinary hypocrisy of these Western powers, particularly when they start, spouting slogans about human rights and the rule of law and accountability and so on.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I likewise would be I'm nervous about kind of prognosticating about how the that is going to develop in the future. Um,
Well,
but
if I can,
yeah, please.
because I think another key issue in the region, particularly in the coming years, is going to be the U.S.-Iranian relationship. And while people have focused very much on the increasingly close ties between Iran and Russia, um, a strategic agreement was signed, in fact, last year or 2 years ago. Uh, Between Iran and China. And it will be very interesting to see what role this agreement is going to play in any growing U.S. hostility to Iran, because very much of Iran's oil is sold to China, and the U.S. is now cracking down on for example, Panamanian flagged oil tankers that are carrying this oil. Does that mean, for example, that China will start sending Chinese flagged oil tankers to Iranian ports to collect oil? I'm just speculating, but one can see, for example, prospects for greater Chinese direct involvement in the region than has been the case. And another one, of course, is the US and the EU have been very slow to lift their sanctions on Syria after the Assad government was overthrown there. Quite clearly, they're maintaining these sanctions that they've always claimed were there to modify or punish the behavior of a government that no longer exists. They're keeping them to kind of make sure Syria dances to their tune. Well, does that offer opportunities for others who are not going to deal with Syria through the prism of sanctions to then begin to play a bigger role there? Russia would be an obvious candidate given its long-standing close relationship with Syria going back to the 1950s, but I don't think Russia is quite in a position to play the role of a substitute for Western economies with respect to Syria, given its own difficulties. That's a role that China could play quite easily. But will it, and if so, how, I think are questions that remain to be answered.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's these are uncertain times. I mean, also with
Yes,
regard, yeah, with regards to the resistance. The resistance seems to be neutralized right now, but also Pezeshkian of Iran. I have no idea what the direction will be under his control. So yeah, lots to see, and I just hope I just hope that this hell is going to be over soon for the Palestinians because it's such a terrible traumatic thing to
certainly.
experience. First and foremost, of course, for the Palestinian people and the rest of the world. I must say it's absolutely devastating. Anyway, yeah, I wish we could stop on a more positive note, but it's not the time for that. I guess we can end it here, Moin. Thank you again for coming on our show. And
Thank you very much.
yeah, always a pleasure to see you, and we will definitely invite you again in the future. You're a busy man, so we'll try
I
and
look forward
refrain
to
from
it.
bothering you too much. And then,
Not at all.
and then we will talk again.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you, Mouin. That was
Thank
great.
you. Goodbye.
All right.
See you
Thank
next time.